The Great Hall of the Galactic Council stretched out like a massive bowl made of crystal and metal. Thousands of beings from across the galaxy sat in their assigned seats, their voices creating a low hum that never stopped. At the center of it all, Chancellor Vextai stood tall on his platform, his body made of living crystal that caught the light and threw it back in rainbow colors. Today was the day they would vote on the human problem. Kang Wu sat in the human section with his team. His black hair was starting to show gray at the edges, and his face showed the weight of 5 years serving as Earth's voice in this place. Next to him, Dr. Li Bo-Ram quietly organized her research files. She had spent 3 years trying to share human medical discoveries with other species, only to watch as committee after committee found reasons to delay or reject her work. Captain Park Min-ho sat straight in his military uniform, his eyes watching, everything but saying nothing. The vote had been building for months. Species after species had complained about human expansion, human technology, human influence. The Alterians said humans grew too fast. The Zentari claimed human ships were too advanced for such a young race. The collective worried that human ideas about freedom and choice were spreading to their controlled populations. Chancellor Vextai raised one crystalline arm, and the hall fell silent. His voice rang out clear and cold like breaking ice. The motion before us today concerns restrictions on human military expansion and limitations on human technology sharing. We have heard many concerns from our member species about the rapid growth of human influence in our galaxy. Kang Wu had known this day would come. The signs had been there for months. Closed meetings he was not invited to. Trade agreements, suddenly needing review. Requests for human assistance that were approved but then quietly forgotten. The galaxy's older species had decided that humanity was growing too dangerous to ignore. The Alterian delegate stood up, his blue skin shimmering. Under the lights, humans have established colonies in 47 systems in just 50 years. This rate of expansion threatens the established order. We must act to maintain stability. A representative from the hegemony nodded agreement. Human technology advances without proper oversight. They develop weapons and tools that could upset the balance we have maintained for centuries. They share knowledge freely without considering the consequences. One by one, species that had once welcomed human help now spoke against them. The Vorthon Empire complained about human trade practices being too fair and making their own merchants look bad. The Crystalline Confederation worried that human exploration ships were finding resources that should belong to older, more established races. Through it all, Kang Wu remained silent. He could have stood up and defended his species. He could have reminded them of the times human medical teams had stopped plagues on their worlds. He could have talked about the human ships that had rescued their people from disasters. He could have mentioned the trade deals that had brought prosperity to dozens of systems. Instead, he watched and listened. Dr. Li Bo-Ram's hands had stopped moving over her files. She stared straight ahead with an expression that looked almost sad. Captain Park Min-ho's jaw was tight, but he said nothing. The vote was not close. 87 species voted to restrict human expansion to their current territories. 92 voted to require all human technology to be reviewed by council committees before it could be shared or traded. Only 12 species voted against the measures. Even some that humans had helped in the past voted with the majority. When the final count was announced, Chancellor Vextai turned his glowing eyes toward the human section. Ambassador Kang Wu, do you wish to respond to the council's decision? For a long moment, Kang Wu said nothing. The entire hall waited. Thousands of beings watched to see how humanity would react. Would they argue? Would they threaten to leave? Would they beg for reconsideration? Kang Wu stood up slowly. His voice was calm and quiet, but somehow it carried to every corner of the vast hall. The human delegation acknowledges the council's decision. We will comply with all requirements. And restrictions as voted, that was it. No anger, no protests. No demands for explanation. Dr. Li Bo-Ram began packing her research into secure containers. Captain Park Min-ho gathered his military briefings and sealed them in locked cases. Other human staff members quietly closed their files and prepared to leave. Chancellor Vextai seemed surprised by the lack of drama. Ambassador, surely you understand that these measures are for the good of galactic stability. Perhaps we could discuss implementation timelines or— There is nothing to discuss, Kang Wu said softly. The Council has spoken clearly. Humanity thanks the Council for the lessons learned during our membership. Something in his tone made several alien delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. The Zentari representative leaned forward. What do you mean by that, Ambassador? But Kang Wu was already walking toward the exit. Dr. Lee Boram and Captain Park Min-ho followed him, along with the rest of the human delegation. Their footsteps echoed in the sudden silence of the Great Hall. As they reached the massive doors, Chancellor Vextai called out again. Ambassador Kang, when can we expect formal compliance reports? The Council will need to monitor— Kang Wu paused without turning around. All required reports will be filed according to Council regulations. Good day, Chancellor. The doors closed behind them with a sound like thunder. Within hours, something strange began happening across human space. On 47 worlds, human, governors received the same message from Earth. Colonial administrators started receiving new orders. Trade officials found updated instructions in their communication systems. The orders were simple and clear. All council-related activities would cease in exactly 72 hours. Trade agreements would be honored to the letter until their expiration dates, then not renewed. Diplomatic staff were to submit formal resignations and prepare for departure. Military units were to withdraw from all joint operations and return to human space. On the trading station at Kepler 442b, manager Kim Soo-jin received the message while she was in the middle of negotiating a grain shipment to 3 different alien worlds. She read it twice, then quietly finished her current deals. When the hegemony representative asked about renewing their contract for the next year, she politely explained that would not be possible. Captain Yoon Dae-ho was leading a joint patrol with Altarian ships when his orders came through. He informed his alien counterparts that human ships would be withdrawing from the sector, wished them well, and jumped his fleet back to human space without further explanation. Dr. Jung Ha-young had been working on a cure for a disease affecting the Zentari homeworld. She carefully packaged all her research, but somehow the most crucial data files became corrupted during transfer to council systems. The basic information was there, but the key formulas and processes that made the cure work were mysteriously missing. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out. Humans simply and quietly began to leave. They did not break any agreements. They did not violate any contracts. They just stopped making new ones. The galactic stock markets noticed first. Human corporations were major players in interstellar trade. When they began withdrawing from long-term contracts and refusing new partnerships, prices started to fluctuate wildly. Then the shipping companies realized that human logistics firms handled nearly 30% of all cargo movement between star systems. Routes that had run smoothly for decades suddenly had no ships available to carry goods. Chancellor Vextai watched the reports with growing concern. This was not what he had expected. When young species were disciplined by the Council, they usually protested for a while, then settled into their assigned role. They did not simply vanish. By the end of the week, not a single human remained in Council space except for a few merchant ships completing their final contracted deliveries. The human embassy building stood empty. The research facilities that had shared human discoveries with other species were cleared out and locked. The galaxy had voted to limit humanity, and humanity had simply walked away. 6 months had passed since the humans left, and Trade Administrator Yelton stared at his screens with growing panic. The numbers made no sense. Production on Kepler 442b had dropped by 40%, and no one seemed to understand why. The factories were still running. The workers still came to their jobs every day. The machines still functioned properly. But somehow, everything moved slower now. Orders got mixed up. Shipments arrived at the wrong times. Supply chains that had worked perfectly for years now broke down for mysterious reasons. Yelton called his section managers to a meeting in the main conference room. The Altarian supervisor arrived first, his blue skin looking pale under the high artificial lights. The Zentari production chief came next, followed by representatives from 4 other species. "Can someone explain to me why our output has collapsed?" Yeltan demanded, his tentacles waving in frustration. "We have the same equipment, the same workers, the same facilities. What changed?" The Alterian supervisor shifted uncomfortably. "Well, sir, the humans used to handle most of our coordination tasks. They had this way of making all our different systems work together. Since they left, we have been trying to manage those functions ourselves, but—" "But what?" Yelton interrupted. "But none of us really understood how they did it," the Zentari admitted. "They made it look easy. They would take our incompatible computer systems and somehow get them to share information perfectly. They solved problems between departments that had been fighting for years. When equipment broke down, they always knew how to fix it quickly." Yelton felt his stomach sink. "Are you telling me that we were completely dependent on human workers for basic operations?" The room fell silent. The truth was uncomfortable, but it could not be denied. Humans had not just been employees on their world. They had been the connective tissue that held everything together. The same story was playing out across hundreds of worlds throughout the galaxy. On Zentari Prime, Dr. Zilara stood in her laboratory surrounded by data crystals that contained human research. For 3 years, human scientists had shared their discoveries freely with her team. Cures for 17 different diseases, agricultural techniques that could triple crop yields, energy systems that produced no waste. All the data was there, but somehow it was incomplete. The humans had shared their results, but not the crucial steps that made those results possible. It was like having a recipe that listed ingredients but not the cooking methods. Dr. Zilara picked up a crystal containing research on cell regeneration therapy. The human team had demonstrated the treatment working perfectly on test subjects from a dozen different species. The data showed exactly what happened during the healing process, but the key information about how to actually perform the treatment was missing. She tried contacting the human research team that had worked with her, but their communication channels were no longer active. Their laboratory in human space had been shut down, and all the researchers had been reassigned to projects that did not involve alien cooperation. Meanwhile, in the Outer Rim territories, Captain Veltar of the Hegemony Navy received his 15th distress call of the week. Pirates had attacked another merchant convoy, and his ships were too far away to help. The raiders would be long gone by the time his fleet arrived. This was becoming a serious problem. For years, human patrol ships had quietly maintained security throughout the outer systems. They had never made a big show of it. No dramatic battles or heroic rescues that made the news. They had simply been there, watching and responding when needed. Now they were gone, and predators were emerging from the dark spaces between stars. Raiders who had been afraid to operate in areas with human presence were now attacking freely. The Hegemony Navy was stretched too thin to cover all the trade routes that needed protection. Captain Veltar studied his tactical displays with growing frustration. His ships were powerful and well-armed, but they followed rigid patrol patterns that had been established decades ago. Human captains had been different. They seemed to know instinctively where trouble would appear. They could predict pirate behavior and position their ships to intercept attacks before they happened. Without that intuitive approach to security, the Outer Rim was becoming increasingly dangerous. Merchant ships were traveling in larger convoys for protection, which slowed down trade and increased costs. Some routes were being abandoned entirely. On the core worlds, the effects were becoming visible in other ways. The Galactic Exchange on Altaria Prime showed massive red numbers on its main display. Stock prices for major corporations had dropped by an average of 30%. Currency exchange rates fluctuated wildly as traders struggled to adapt to a galaxy without human economic participation. Financial analyst Kexara studied the market reports with professional concern. Human companies had not been the largest players in galactic trade, but they had been the most reliable. When they made agreements, they honored them completely. When they invested in projects, those projects succeeded. When they backed new technologies, those technologies actually worked. More importantly, humans had been the species that other races trusted to mediate disputes. If an Alterian company had problems with a Zentari supplier, they would often ask human arbitrators to resolve the issue. Humans seemed to understand how different species thought and could find solutions that satisfied everyone. Without that stabilizing influence, old conflicts were starting to resurface. Trade disputes that had been resolved years ago were being reopened. Species that had learned to work together with human help were remembering why they had not trusted each other in the first place. The situation was worst on worlds where humans had made up significant portions of the population. On industrial planets, human engineers had designed systems that other species could operate but not modify or repair. When equipment broke down, local technicians found themselves dealing with technology they did not fully understand. On agricultural worlds, human farmers had introduced crops and techniques that produced amazing yields, but the knowledge of how to maintain those systems had left with them. Harvest outputs were dropping as alien farmers struggled to replicate human methods. Even on military bases, the absence of human personnel was causing problems. Human soldiers had been known for their adaptability and creative thinking in combat situations. They served as advisors and trainers for alien forces, helping them develop new tactics and strategies. Without human military advisors, many alien forces found themselves falling back on old, predictable patterns that had been standard for centuries. Their effectiveness dropped significantly when they faced opponents who used unconventional tactics. Chancellor Vextai stood in his private office, looking out at the capital city of Altaria Prime through crystal walls. The city still functioned, but something felt different. The energy and optimism that had characterized the galactic community for the past few decades seemed to be fading. His aide, a young Altarian named Zex Unno, entered with another stack of reports. Chancellor, we have received formal requests for assistance from 47 different worlds. Most are experiencing significant economic or operational difficulties. Vextai took the reports but did not read them immediately. Have any of these worlds specifically mentioned the human departure as a factor? Most of them, sir, Zexuno replied carefully. It appears that human involvement in galactic affairs was more extensive than our initial assessments indicated. The Chancellor felt a chill run through his crystalline body. When the Council had voted to restrict human activities, they had been thinking about military threats and technological advantages. No one had considered the possibility that humans had become essential to basic galactic operations. What about communication with human authorities? Vextai asked. Have they responded to any requests for cooperation or assistance? Zexuno hesitated. They have responded to humanitarian requests, sir. Human medical ships have provided aid to refugee populations, and they have accepted alien civilians who needed emergency evacuation from disaster zones. But they have declined all requests for technical assistance, military cooperation, or trade negotiations. Vextai finally looked at the reports. Each one told a similar story. Worlds that had thrived with human involvement were now struggling with problems they could not solve alone. The galaxy had become dependent on human abilities without realizing it. The most disturbing report came from the intelligence services. Human space had gone quiet in a way that suggested major internal activity. Construction projects were detected in multiple systems, but their purpose was unclear. Human ships were moving in patterns that did not match any known exploration or colonization activities. Whatever humanity was doing in their own territory, they were doing it without any input or oversight from the galactic community. For the first time since humans had joined the Galactic Council, no one knew what they were planning or what they were capable of achieving on their own. The galaxy was beginning to understand that humans had walked away with more than just their ships and people. They had taken their knowledge, their skills, and their unique ability to make different species work together effectively. What remained was a galaxy that had forgotten how to function without them. 2 years had passed since the humans left, and the emergency session of the Galactic Council looked nothing like the confident assembly that had voted to restrict human activities. Half the seats in the Great Hall were empty. 12 species had withdrawn from the Council entirely, unable to maintain their membership dues as their economies collapsed. Others sent only junior representatives, their senior diplomats too busy dealing with crises at home. Chancellor Vextai stood at his platform, but his crystalline body had lost much of its former brilliance, the rainbow lights that once danced. Through his form now appeared dim and flickering. Around him, the remaining delegates looked tired and desperate. The situation has become untenable, announced Representative Kolinar from the Hegemony Worlds. Our outer colonies are under constant attack by raiders. Our trade routes are collapsing. Our industrial output has dropped by 60%. We need to discuss bringing the humans back into the council." A murmur of agreement swept through the hall. The proud species that had once worried about human expansion now faced the reality of trying to maintain their civilizations without human assistance. Dr. Zilara stood up from the scientific advisory section. Her usual calm demeanor had been replaced by obvious stress. "The medical situation is becoming critical. We have 17 different plague outbreaks across the galaxy, and our response capabilities are severely limited without human research support. The treatments they shared with us before their departure are no longer effective against evolved strains of these diseases." The Zentari delegate nodded grimly. "Our agricultural systems are failing. Crop yields are down by 40% on most of our worlds. The human farming techniques that had increased our food production cannot be maintained without their expertise. We are facing potential famine conditions within a year." Chancellor Vextai listened to report after report of failure and decline. The galaxy that had seemed so stable and prosperous just 2 years ago was coming apart at the seams. "Has anyone maintained diplomatic contact with human authorities?" he asked. The hall fell silent. Finally, the collective representatives spoke up hesitantly. "We have tried numerous times to establish communication channels. Human responses have been polite, but limited. They provide humanitarian aid when requested, but they decline all offers of renewed cooperation or trade." "What exactly do they say when contacted?" Vextai pressed. "Usually something like, 'Humanity is focusing on internal development,' or 'We wish our former council colleagues well,'" the representative replied. "They do not seem angry or hostile. They simply appear to have moved on to other priorities." This was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the situation. If humans had left in anger, the council could have hoped for eventual reconciliation. If they had demanded apologies or concessions, negotiations could have been possible. Instead, they seemed genuinely indifferent to galactic affairs. Intelligence Director Maltara stood up with a new report that made the situation even more alarming. "Our long-range sensors have detected massive construction activity in human space. They appear to be building installations of unprecedented size and complexity. Some of these structures are larger than our biggest space stations." She activated a holographic display that showed fuzzy images captured by spy satellites at the edge of human territory. Strange ring-shaped structures hung in space near human colonies. Ships moved between worlds using flight patterns that made no sense according to known physics. Energy readings suggested technologies that should not have been possible. "How did they advance so far so quickly?" demanded the Alterian delegate. 2 years ago, their technology was roughly equivalent to our own. These readings suggest capabilities that are decades ahead of anything we have developed." Intelligence Director Maltara shook her head. "We do not know. Human space has become effectively closed to outside observation. They have established some kind of sensor barrier that prevents detailed scanning of their activities." The implications were staggering. While the galaxy had been struggling to maintain basic functions without human assistance, humanity had apparently been advancing at an incredible rate. Whatever they were building in their isolated space, it was beyond current galactic understanding. Chancellor Vextai made the decision that everyone had been avoiding. "We will send an official delegation to request human participation in the Council again. Prepare a formal proposal offering significant concessions in exchange for renewed cooperation." The delegation that traveled to the edge of human space included representatives from the most powerful remaining Council species. They expected to find the same modest colonies and simple installations that had characterized human space when the species first joined the galactic community. Instead, they encountered something that challenged everything they thought they knew about technological development. The border station where they were received was a work of art and engineering that seemed to defy physics. Crystalline structures grew from metal frameworks in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The station itself appeared to be partially existing in normal space and partially somewhere else entirely. Ambassador Sung Haiwan greeted the delegation in a reception area that somehow felt larger inside than the station could possibly contain. She was younger than Kang Wu had been, with short black hair and dark eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. Her manner was polite but distant. Like someone entertaining guests, she had no particular interest in knowing better. Chancellor, Vexte sends his regards, the lead Altarian delegate began formally, and wishes to discuss humanity's return to the Galactic Council. We are prepared to offer significant concessions regarding the restrictions that were previously voted into place. Sung Haiwan listened patiently as the delegate outlined a new proposal that would give humans more autonomy than any species had ever been granted in Council history. They offered unrestricted expansion rights, exemption from technology sharing, requirements, and a permanent seat on the ruling committee. When the presentation finished, Sung Haiwan was quiet for a long moment. Through the transparent walls of the reception area, the delegates could see human vessels moving with impossible grace through space. One ship appeared to fold space around itself and vanish, only to reappear instantly in a completely different location. The Council's offer is generous, Sung Haiwan finally said, but humanity no longer requires Council approval for our activities. We have moved beyond the limitations that once constrained us. The Zentari delegate leaned forward desperately. You must understand the situation. Without human assistance, our civilizations are collapsing. Billions of lives are at stake. Surely that means something to you. Sung Haiwan's expression softened slightly. Of course it means something. That is why we continue to provide humanitarian aid to refugee populations and emergency medical assistance when requested. But our role as members of the Galactic Council has ended. How is this possible? Whispered the hegemony representative, staring out at the impossible technologies on display around them. How did you advance so far in just 2 years? For the first time, Sung Haiwan smiled, but it was not a pleasant expression. You spent decades teaching us that we were limited by galactic standards and traditions. You established committees to review our research and approve our development projects. You created regulations to control our expansion and restrictions to limit our influence. She gestured toward the window, where a structure the size of a small moon was becoming visible in the distance. Its surface crawled with energy patterns that seemed alive. It never occurred to any of you that maybe galactic standards were what was limiting us, she continued. When we were forced to work within your systems, we could only achieve what your systems allowed. When we left those systems behind, we discovered what we were actually capable of. The delegation sat in stunned silence. The humans had not just left the council, they had transcended it entirely. What do you want from us? The Altarian delegate asked quietly. Nothing, Sung Haiwan replied simply. We want nothing from the galactic community. We are content to develop our own civilization according to our own values and capabilities. And if the galaxy collapses without your help? Pressed the Zentari representative. Sung Haiwan looked at him with something that might have been pity. Then perhaps the galaxy will learn to build something better from the ruins. Growth requires change, and change is often painful. The delegation returned to council space with recordings and sensor data that sent shockwaves through what remained of the galactic government. Humanity had not just grown more powerful. They had become something that existing science could not explain or predict. The species that had once worried about human expansion now faced a far more terrifying possibility. What if humans decided that the galaxy itself was not worth preserving? What if they simply watched as older civilizations collapsed and died out, then built something entirely new in the empty space left behind? For the first time since the founding of the Galactic Council, member species began to truly understand what it meant to be obsolete. The 4th year after humanity's departure brought the catastrophe that changed everything. It started as a dark spot on the edge of known space, detected by automated sensors monitoring the galactic rim. Within days, that spot had grown into a fleet of bioships unlike anything the galaxy had ever faced. The Torvan Empire had awakened from centuries of dormancy in the void between galaxies. Their ships were not built, but grown, massive living vessels that consumed matter and converted it directly into more ships. They moved through space like a plague, devouring entire worlds and leaving nothing behind but empty shells of rock. Admiral Sektar of the Galactic Defense Force watched the tactical displays from his command ship with growing horror. 3 outer rim colonies had already been consumed, their populations of billions simply gone. The bioships showed no interest in conquest or negotiation. They existed only to feed and multiply. "What are our casualty estimates?" he asked his tactical officer. "Lieutenant." Valimora checked her displays with shaking hands. "Complete loss of all 3 systems, sir. No survivors detected." The Torvan ship stripped the worlds down to bedrock, consuming all organic and metallic materials. The Admiral stared at the display showing the expanding red zone that marked Torvan-controlled space. At their current rate of expansion, they would reach the core worlds within 2 years. "Send emergency requests for assistance to all member species. We need every available ship for the defense fleet." The response was disappointing, but not surprising. Half the Council species could barely maintain their own security forces after years of economic decline. Those that still had functional militaries were reluctant to commit their ships to what looked like a hopeless battle. The Galactic Defense Force that assembled to face the Torvan threat was the weakest in Council history. Outdated ships with mismatched systems, crews from species that had never learned to work together effectively, and command structures that relied on rigid tactics developed centuries ago, Admiral Sektar knew they were going to lose. The question was whether they could slow the Torvans down long enough for someone to find a solution. The first major battle took place at the Centauri Junction, a strategic system that controlled access to 3 major trade routes. The Defense Force positioned their ships in a defensive formation that had worked well against conventional enemies in the past. The Torvan bioships ignored conventional tactics entirely. They flowed through space like liquid death, absorbing weapons fire that should have destroyed them and converting the energy into rapid reproduction. For every bioship the Defense Force destroyed, 2 more emerged from the wreckage. Admiral Sektar watched his fleet being systematically consumed. Ships that had served the galaxy for decades were pulled apart by tendrils of living metal. Crews that had trained together for years were dissolved in acid pools as their vessels were digested from the inside. "Fall back to the secondary defense." "Line!" he ordered, but it was already too late. The Torvans had surrounded his remaining ships. His own command vessel shuddered as biotendrils wrapped around its hull. The Admiral's last transmission was a desperate plea broadcast across all channels. "This is Admiral Sektar to all human vessels. The galaxy needs your help. Please respond." In D. Human space, Admiral Choi Kyung-soo received the transmission aboard the flagship Indomitable Spirit. The vessel hung in space near Earth's outer colonies, its hull gleaming with crystalline sections that seemed to phase in and out of normal reality. Around it, the human defense fleet maintained a watchful presence unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Lieutenant Kim So-young looked up from her communications station. "Sir, we are receiving multiple distress calls from Galactic Defense Forces. They are requesting immediate military assistance against the Torvan invasion." Admiral Choi studied the tactical displays showing the spreading zone of Torvan control. His staff had been tracking the invasion since it began, running detailed analyses of Torvan capabilities and expansion patterns. "Any change in our assessment of the threat level?" Commander Na Woo-jin consulted his strategic planning console. "No, sir. Torvan forces remain consistent with our predictions. At current expansion rates, they will consume approximately 40% of galactic civilization within 18 months. "And if they reach human space?" the Admiral asked. "Our defensive systems are fully capable of neutralizing the Torvan threat," Commander Na replied without hesitation. "The bioships operate using principles that our countermeasures were specifically designed to defeat." Admiral Choi nodded slowly. He had access to strategic assessments that painted a clear picture of what was happening. Humanity had known about the Torvan Empire for years, had tracked their movements through deep space, and had prepared accordingly. The current invasion was not a surprise, but rather a predicted event that fitted into larger plans. "Continue monitoring galactic communications," he ordered. "Maintain defensive positions. No intervention unless Torvan forces approach human territory." This was the test that human leadership had been waiting for. Not a test of military capability, but a test of character for the species that had voted them out of the Council. Would they learn from disaster? Would they find strength in unity when facing extinction? Or would they simply fragment and die as so many civilizations had before them? The answer became clear as more systems fell to the Torvans. Instead of uniting against the common threat, many species began abandoning their allies to save themselves. The collective withdrew its ships to defend only their core worlds. The hegemony recalled its fleets to protect their most valuable colonies. Trade alliances collapsed as each species prioritized their own survival. Chancellor Vextai watched his civilization crumble from his emergency command center on Alteria Prime. The crystal cities that had stood for millennia were being evacuated as refugees fled toward the galactic core. His own people, once proud and confident in their superior technology, now huddled in transport ships like any other desperate civilians. "Have we received any response from human authorities?" he asked his aide. Zexuno checked his communications panel with little hope. "They acknowledge our transmissions but provide only humanitarian assistance coordinates. They have established refugee camps at the edges of human space but offer no military support." The Chancellor felt his crystalline form dimming with despair. Humanity was watching the galaxy burn and doing nothing to stop it. They had the power to intervene. That much was obvious from the impossible technologies they had displayed, but they chose to remain passive observers. "Why?" he whispered. "Why do they not help us?" Dr. Yoon Mi-kyung could have answered that question from her office in the Human Strategic Assessment Division. The walls around her were covered with detailed projections showing the probable outcomes of various intervention scenarios. Every possible human response to the Torvan invasion had been analyzed and its long-term consequences calculated. Military intervention would save galactic civilization in the short term, but would restore the old patterns of dependence and stagnation. The galaxy would learn nothing from the crisis and would continue making the same mistakes that had led to their current weakness. Humanitarian assistance without military support would allow natural selection to operate on a civilizational scale. Species that could adapt and overcome would survive and grow stronger. Those that could not would be replaced by others better suited to the challenges of an expanding universe. The numbers were harsh but clear. Allowing the Torvan crisis to run its course would result in the deaths of approximately 40 billion sentient beings across the galaxy. However, it would also eliminate the institutional structures and cultural assumptions that had kept galactic civilizations static for centuries. From the perspective of human strategic planning, this was an acceptable exchange. Humanity had learned to think in terms of species survival rather than individual comfort. They had accepted that growth required destruction, that evolution demanded extinction, and that the future belonged to those willing to pay its price. As the Torvan bioships continued their relentless advance toward the core worlds, human observers maintained their clinical detachment. They provided refuge for civilians who reached human space and medical treatment for survivors of destroyed worlds. But they offered no hope of salvation for civilizations that had proven themselves incapable of salvation. The galaxy had taught humanity a hard lesson about the price of weakness. Now humanity was teaching the galaxy an even harder lesson about the consequences of that weakness. The test would continue until either galactic civilization found the strength to save itself, or until only the strong remained to build something better from the ashes. The war against the Torvans reached its turning point in the 7th year, but not in the way anyone expected. By then, half the galaxy had been consumed, billions had died, and the surviving species had learned lessons written in blood and ash across countless worlds. The bioships had grown massive beyond imagination, some the size of small moons, fed by the matter of entire star systems. They moved toward the core worlds with the inevitability of a natural disaster, consuming everything in their path. The desperate remnants of galactic civilization had finally learned to work together, but it seemed too late. Then the Torvan fleet reached the edges of human space. Captain Lee Dong-wook commanded the automated defense station Guardian's Watch, at the border between human and galactic territory. His crew monitored the massive bioships approaching with the same calm professionalism they brought to all their duties. The station itself was a marvel of human engineering, a crystalline structure that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that had no names. "Torvan lead elements have crossed the boundary marker," reported his tactical officer, Lieutenant Park Ji-min. "They are beginning scanning sweeps of our outer colonies." Captain Lee activated the defense protocols that had been waiting patiently for this moment. Begin Phase 1 implementation. All stations commence countermeasures. What happened next would be studied by the survivors for generations. The Torvan bioships, which had proven immune to every weapon the galaxy could deploy, simply stopped moving. Their hulls, which had adapted to absorb energy weapons and resist physical damage, began dissolving at the molecular level. The consuming plague that had made the Torvans unstoppable turned against itself. Their genetic code, perfected over millions of years of evolution, unraveled like a broken chain. Ships that had devoured worlds crumbled into basic elements and drifted away as cosmic dust. Within 72 hours, the Torvan Empire ceased to exist. Not defeated, not driven back, but completely and utterly erased from reality. No human ship had fired a single shot. No human soldier had died in combat. The galaxy's greatest threat had been eliminated by automated systems that treated it like a minor maintenance problem. From his command center on Earth, Admiral Choi Kyung-soo watched the final Torvan bioship dissolve into nothingness. The threat that had consumed half the galaxy had been neutralized with the efficiency of an immune system destroying a virus. All stations report successful completion of defensive operations, he announced. Stand down to normal alert status. Savoy. Message that went out to the surviving galactic governments was simple and direct. The Torvan threat has been eliminated. Human space remains secure. Humanitarian assistance continues to be available for refugee populations. Chancellor Vextai received that message in his temporary headquarters on one of the few Alterian worlds that had survived the invasion. His crystalline form had grown dim and cracked from years of stress and loss, but he could still feel amazement at what he had witnessed. How? He asked his intelligence director. How did they destroy something that our entire galaxy could not even slow down? Director Maltara had been studying the sensor readings from the Torvan elimination for weeks. We believe they used some form of programmed molecular disassembly technology. The Torvan bioships were not destroyed by external force, but by internal collapse of their biological systems. But how did they develop such weapons? The Chancellor pressed. 7 years ago, their technology was comparable to ours. The intelligence director looked uncomfortable. Sir, I believe they had these capabilities before they left the Council. Our analysts think they have been holding back their true technological level for decades, possibly since they first made contact with galactic civilization. The implications were staggering. Humanity had spent 50 years pretending to be a developing species, while secretly possessing technologies that could reshape reality itself. They had allowed themselves to be restricted and regulated while knowing they could eliminate any threat with minimal effort. 2 months after the Torvan elimination, President Han Ji-soo stood before the reformed Galactic Council in a building that had been hastily constructed on one of the surviving core worlds. The great crystal hall of the original council chambers had been consumed along with most of Alteria Prime, so the new meeting place was smaller and more modest. Only 37 species remained in the council, less than half the membership that had existed before the invasion. The survivors had been changed by their experience of near extinction. The arrogance and complacency that had characterized galactic politics for centuries had been burned away by Torvan fire. President Han was a small woman with graying hair and calm eyes that missed nothing. She spoke without notes or prepared remarks, addressing the assembled delegates as equals rather than subjects. The Galactic Council is welcome to reform under new principles, she announced. Humanity will participate as a member species, not as a supplicant seeking approval for our existence. The terms she outlined were simple but revolutionary. No restrictions on human development or expansion. No committees to review human technology before it could be implemented. No requirement for humans to share discoveries that other species were not ready to use responsibly. In exchange, humanity would provide the same services they had always provided: medical assistance, humanitarian aid, security support, and technological consultation for species that requested it. The difference was that these services would now be offered as cooperation between equals rather than assistance from superiors to inferiors. Former Chancellor Vextai, now representing what remained of the Alterian worlds, found himself in the position of a minor delegate seeking favor from a species he had once tried to restrict. The irony was not lost on him, but he had learned too much about survival to let pride interfere with necessity. What guarantees do we have that humanity will not use their obvious technological advantages to dominate galactic civilization? He asked. President Han smiled slightly. The same guarantee you have always had. Our word backed by our actions. Over the past 50 years. We could have dominated the galaxy at any time since we first made contact. Instead, we chose to participate as equals and withdraw peacefully when that participation was no longer welcome. Ambassador Li Young-ho, who had succeeded Sung Hai-wan as humanity's representative, stood to address the specific concerns that had been raised by various delegations. He was a tall man with serious demeanor and the same quiet confidence that characterized all human diplomats. Some of you fear that humanity will seek revenge for past restrictions or discrimination, he said. This fear is understandable but unnecessary. We bear no grudge against species that acted according to their understanding and limitations. He gestured toward the massive displays that showed the galaxy as it existed now. Worlds being rebuilt, new trade routes being established, and mysterious human installations providing security and support throughout known space. The question facing this council is not what humanity will do with our capabilities, but what the rest of the galaxy will do with the opportunities those capabilities create, he continued. We are here to participate in galactic civilization, not to control it. But neither will we be controlled by those who cannot see beyond their own limitations. The new council that emerged from those negotiations was fundamentally different from the old one. Humans held no special positions or privileges, but their presence changed everything. When species had disputes, they often asked human mediators to help find solutions. When new technologies needed to be developed, human scientists provided consultation and guidance. When security threats emerged, human defense systems provided protection. The difference was that these services were now provided freely between equals rather than grudgingly between superiors and inferiors. Humanity had proven that true power came not from the ability to dominate others, but from the wisdom to know when domination was unnecessary. In the years that followed, the galaxy slowly rebuilt under humanity's watchful presence. New colonies were established using human terraforming techniques. Trade resumed using human logistics systems. Exploration expanded under the protection of human defense networks. But the fundamental balance of power had shifted permanently. No species could again dismiss humanity as just another young race learning its place in galactic society. The quiet, patient humans who had once sat in the junior member section of the council chamber had revealed themselves to be the most advanced civilization the galaxy had ever known. The survivors of the Torvan War understood what their predecessors had failed to grasp. Humanity had not walked away from the council in anger or frustration. They had walked away because they had outgrown the need for galactic approval and were ready to build something better. The council that had once voted to restrict human expansion now existed at human sufferance. The species that had once feared human influence now depended on human protection. The civilization that had once dismissed human contributions now recognized them as essential for survival. Humanity had walked away without a word, and in doing so had proven that sometimes the greatest victory is knowing when not to fight. They had allowed the galaxy to learn its limitations the hard way.